Hi there! Welcome to Pallet University. Generation 8 introduced some drastic changes into how the franchise handles fossil Pokemon, and as somebody who studies paleontology in graduate school, I have so many thoughts and feelings about them. So, we're going to be starting a new mini-series that's not just about the new fossils introduced in Pokemon Sword and Pokemon Shield, but also the older ones as well. If you're excited to get a real paleontologist point of view on these new fossil Pokemon, make sure to hit the subscribe button down below as well as turn on notifications. And if you enjoy this type of content, make sure to click the thumbs up down below as well. Next weekend we'll be doing some live streaming that you won't want to miss out on. You know, being a paleontologist, fossil Pokemon have always been some of my favorites of each new generation. And when back in Generation 7 they didn't introduce any new ones, I was honestly kind of sad. Only Generations 2 and 7 didn't introduce new fossil Pokemon, and with Generation 7 I guess that kind of makes sense because it's based off of Hawaii, which is, completely volcanic rock, and, volcanoes don't tend to preserve things, they kind of just destroy things, but Generation 2, you don't really get a pass. Shame on you, Johto. So just to recap for anyone who doesn't know, Generation 8 broke a lot of the norms that Game Freak has set for themselves over the past, 20 years in terms of fossil Pokemon. For starters, none of them are rock type. And there's also 4, instead of just the 2 that then evolve. And, if you look back into Generation 1, they had the 2 that evolve and then Aerodactyl as well. But all of them that have been introduced before Generation 8 are rock type, but these ones are not. I have been griping about this literally for years, because I want to be able to use fossil Pokemon more competitively, and rock generally isn't the best typing. So them not being rock types opens up a lot of doors for them just being more useful, besides just being kind of gimmicky. But more to the point, fossil Pokemon most likely were not rock types when they were actually alive. The reason that they're rock types is because they are fossils. There's going to be a whole other video in this series about why these ones in particular are not rock type and why fossil Pokemon in general usually are, so that will be later in this series. So if these new ones aren't rock types, then what are they? We're getting a little bit ahead of ourselves here, so before I talk about typings, let's talk about how you actually go about getting these new fossil Pokemon for anyone who doesn't already know. The easiest way to get them is just to save up your watts in the wild area and then go talk to the digging duo near the breeders in the wild area. And there's 2 of them. There's one that's better at stamina, which gets you more but lower quality, whereas the more skilled one gets you a lower number but usually better quality loot. And I don't have any hard data to back this up, but I feel like just spamming on the more skilled one is the best way to go about grinding fossils if you're trying to get evolution stones or other useful but not as rare items. The stamina brother, the one on the right, is probably the one you want to go to, but since we're just talking about fossils, you're better off just spamming talking to this guy until you collect all 4 of them. And honestly, that might take a long while because while they're not version exclusive, they are much more common in one game than the other. So for instance, out of the 4 of them, there's the fossilized dino, the fossilized drake, the fossilized bird, and the fossilized fish. In Pokemon Shield, you are much more likely to find the fossilized fish and fossilized drake, whereas in Pokemon Sword, you're much more likely to find the fossilized dino and fossilized bird. You can find both of them, or all 4 of them rather, but it will take you much longer to get the 2 that are more common in the other game. Once you have spent literally several thousand watts trying to find these fossils, you can then fly to the fly spot on Route 6 and then just go up this little hill and talk to this person named Kara Liss. She'll ask you to pick a top half and a bottom half, and then she'll take the 2 that you give her and only give you back 1 single Pokemon. Because, yeah, as crazy as this sounds, these fossil Pokemon are weird Frankenstein monster fusions of Pokemon. And like I said, there are 4 combinations to make. And here's a handy little Punnett square that scientists commonly use in genetics to understand heritability from parent to offspring, but it works the same way. To figure out which combination of fossils gives you which Pokemon. These new literal monsters are Dracozolt, a dragon electric type, Dracovish, a dragon water type, Arctozolt, an ice electric type, and Arctovish, an ice water type. Most of them are pretty rare type combinations, not really found all that commonly throughout other Pokemon in the game, especially in Sword and Shield after Dexit. And some of these typings are actually really cool, because Dragon Electric, which is Dracozolt, is only found in Zekrom. That is the only other Pokemon that's Dragon Electric type. Whereas Arctozolt is the only true, I guess, Ice Electric type besides Rotom Freeze, which really only gets access to Blizzard, so I don't really count it as like a true Ice Electric type because it's just a different form. It has all the same, defensive typings, but the only Ice type move it gets is Blizzard, and you can't even say it gets Hidden Power Ice anymore because Hidden Power is not in Sword and Shield. Dracovish also has a relatively unique typing it's only shared by two other Pokemon, which are Kingdra and Palkia, two incredibly strong and a Pokemon with a really, really solid defensive typing, only being weak to Dragon and Fairy. And finally, with Arctovish, it is a Water Ice type, which is more common. However, there are certain things about Arctovish that make it sort of unique and really carve out a niche for it in like a competitive scene. But we'll talk about that in Arctovish's specific video, because all four of these are going to get their own video dedicated just to talking about them. And because of that, this video is serving more as an introduction to this series and not really getting too in the weeds for any one particular Pokemon. Instead, I want to talk about some of the inspirations and thoughts that might have went through Game Freak's head when they decided to make such a drastic change to their fossil Pokemon formula. Because there are some really interesting, how do I even want to word this? Really interesting events throughout paleontological history, I guess is the best way to word it, that could have and probably did inspire Game Freak to create these Pokemon, especially in a region based off of the United Kingdom, which has a really, really rich paleontological history. When it was first announced that Galar was based off of the United Kingdom, I got so excited because of how rich that paleontological history is. It's really the birthplace of modern paleontology and the first real, time and science really went into paleontology in the United Kingdom. And despite it being such a relatively small landmass, there's a huge diversity of fossil life in the United Kingdom. So they really had no lack of options, that's for sure. But they decided to, instead of, going what most people assumed they would just, pick two random extinct animals and make two Pokemon out of them. Really four Pokemon out of them because of the evolutions. But they just completely shattered that notion. I was actually going to make a video about this, but I kind of ran out of time before launch. But I anticipated the fossil Pokemon being based off of an Iguanodon and an Ichthyosaur, two of the first discovered animals from the age of dinosaurs, one being a dinosaur and one being, well, an Ichthyosaur. They're kind of their own group of animals. And they're both found in the United Kingdom. And well, now we all know that clearly didn't happen, so why did they choose to go this route? I think a really big portion of it dates back to some of the early days of paleontology when, to be frank, we didn't really know what we were doing. It's easy to look back now and point out some of the pretty obvious mistakes that early paleontologists made, but with some animals like dinosaurs, we don't really have any modern analogs to compare them to. At least if you found something like mammoth bones, any zoologist worth their degree could tell you that vaguely, that's an elephant. Whereas, especially back then, before evolutionary theory had really gotten a firm, foothold, dinosaurs don't have any modern descendants that are easily recognizable, especially if you're looking at any of the groups of dinosaurs that did not evolve into birds. Back then, it would be another 125 years before we even started to think that birds evolved from dinosaurs. So they really were working from scratch. So, obviously in the early days, some mistakes were understandably made. But let's talk about one of the most fun mistakes that was made, and that's about the Iguanodon. Iguanodon is a hadrosaur, or a duck-billed dinosaur, that's really well known nowadays for one thing, and that's having a really big spike on their thumb. No other hadrosaurs really had that, or at least nearly as pronounced as Iguanodon does. And nowadays we know that it was used for defense. However, when they found it, they basically just assumed that it was a horn that was in the wrong place, and when they were putting skeletons together, they put the thumb on the end of its nose because they thought it was a horn. And looking at animals alive today, like rhinos, where else would you put a horn? At the time, paleontology was such a fad because it was like the new big science thing, that a sculptor was hired to create this big sculpture of some of these dinosaurs that they were unearthing, and oh lord, looking back on some of them now, they're so inaccurate, but they didn't know any better at the time. In fact, one model that was made by this sculptor was actually kind of retrofitted and turned into like this weird kind of dinner party. So like they kind of carved out the middle, added a floor, and then put some dinner tables for socialites, the rich people in, I believe, London, I'm not sure specifically, somewhere in the United Kingdom, to have some parties in. Now, that incident particularly happened around the 1850s, and it probably serves some inspiration for the mismatched fossils, but I think that there was another event in paleontology that was more influential in the idea for these fusions. In the late 1870s through early 1890s here in North America, there was sort of a period in paleontology that we now call the Bone Wars. I've talked about it a little bit on the channel before, but very long story short, two old rich dudes basically were trying to outdo each other. They were the most senior, I guess, the most experienced paleontologists at the time, and they basically were trying to outcompete each other for who could name the most species. And that led to so much bad science and damage being done to future paleontologists. If something looked even slightly different than something that was already discovered, they would say, oh, that's different enough to give it a new name, just so they could add another tally to the list of animals that they've named compared to the other guy. In reality, we know that, different members of the same species can have variation. That's why I'm roughly 6'1", whereas I have a cousin who's only a year younger than me, who is like 5'5". Clearly, within a species, there can be variation, and they were just like, no, that's a completely different species, just because I say so. And you might be surprised to hear this is actually what happened with the animal Brontosaurus. Brontosaurus is not a real name. That's not a real animal. Brontosaurus is just a misnomer for another species of sauropod, the long-necked dinosaurs. There was a paper back in 2015 that was published basically re-establishing Brontosaurus as a valid genus, but I've read all 400 plus pages of that paper, and I don't really believe them. Their methods were a little shoddy, and it seemed like they were mostly just doing it to get media attention for their paper. So I personally, and the majority of paleontologists, don't really believe that Brontosaurus is actually a real thing. Got a little bit off topic there. Sorry, I like nerding out about dinosaurs. Anyway, while that has been the most annoying thing that happened in the Bone Wars for modern paleontologists to figure out, there was also some pretty silly things that happened. Sometimes they would kind of mess up which end of a sauropod was the neck and which end was the tail. So occasionally you would end up with a skull mounted on the tail of a sauropod dinosaur, which obviously is not correct. If you know anything about paleontology, or really just modern anatomy, it doesn't even have to be anatomy of, extinct animals, it could be modern animal anatomy, you would very easily be able to tell neck vertebrae apart from tail vertebrae. They're really not that hard to figure out. But that just shows the level of incompetence, both in like the help that they hired to collect these things, because they themselves knew what they were doing. But the people that they hired were basically just people that they could afford on a relatively cheap budget who didn't really know what they were doing. Their collection camps were sometimes so disorganized that two specimens would end up sort of jumbled together, and they didn't really figure out that, this was actually two animals until they tried to, mount it, and then they're like, oh, wait a minute, these bones don't actually fit together. Which brings us back to Pokemon, because looking at some of these new Pokemon, they clearly do not fit together. At the end of the day, though, I give Game Freak a lot of credit for trying to do something new. People have been complaining. I remember when the new cycle for Sun and Moon were coming out, people were like, oh, it's going to be the same old thing from Game Freak. It's going to be 8 badges. Before we knew anything about Sun and Moon. It's going to be 8 badges. It's going to be the Elite Four. You're going to become the champion, blah, blah, blah. Throughout Generation 7 and 8, they have broken so many of their own norms in unexpected and sometimes ways that don't necessarily pan out. And I think that this, for me personally, is one of them. And that mostly comes down to the fact that these aren't real Pokemon. Pokemon are pretty much analogous to animals in our world, but, you know, if you were to take the bones of a chicken and the bones of a human and try to stitch them together, what would come out would just be some horrible abomination. And that's really what these are. These are not Pokemon, these are science experiments. These 4 Pokemon that are revived from these fossils did not actually exist until Keralis revived them for you. But that is going to be the topic for our next video in this series, coming out sometime next week. I want to thank you so much for watching. Make sure to let me know your thoughts on these 4 new fossil Pokemon down below. Whether you think that they're kind of atrocious monsters, whether you think they're kind of cool looking, because I'm not going to object that they're kind of cool looking, I just think that they're genetic monstrosities. Let me know your thoughts on just having Pokemon of these new kind of unique typings around, because I think the more Pokemon of different typings that there are, the more flushed out the game feels to me. Anyway, make sure to follow us on Twitter at Pallet_U to keep up on all things Pokemon science. If you enjoy this kind of content and think it's worth supporting, we do have a Patreon, the link to which will be down in the description as always. And as always, there's a time and place for everything.